thanks for joining another one of my online investment talks. I'm Mark Simpson, and in the last few talks I've covered some of the most controversial topics in investing. Whether you should average down, for example, and whether value investing is truly an ex-parrot or merely sleeping. Do check these out on my channel if you haven't done so already. For this week's lockdown entertainment, I'm going to be covering another controversial topic. Is diversification diworsification? Let's jump right in. The phrase diversification was made famous by Warren Buffett and comes from the idea that diversification doesn't make sense if you're careful about your investment selection. He says diversification is protection against ignorance. It makes little sense if you know what you're doing. The idea is often described as putting your eggs in one basket, but watching that basket like a hawk. In a similar vein, Buffett also came up with the idea of a 20-slot punch card, giving just 20 investments that an investor was allowed to make in a lifetime. And once it was punched out, you were left with that portfolio forever. He says that with that idea in place, you'd really think carefully about what you did and be forced to load up on what you'd really thought about. He clearly thinks that the average investor spends too little time analysing their stock picks in enough detail and relies on diversification as a crutch to save them from this mistake. However, in contrast, diversification has also been described as a free lunch. In fact, Harry Markowitz describes it as the only free lunch that the market gives. The idea is that diversification is the only real market advantage that you can have without a trade-off and paying for it in another way. So which is it? Should we avoid diversification because it will damage our returns if we know what we're doing? Or should we gorge ourselves on it because it's a cost-free advantage? Well, I think that the dichotomy between return killer or free lunch is the wrong way of thinking about diversification. We have to stop thinking that diversification is simply good or bad and change our mindset to one of finding the right level of diversification for our unique strategy. So, what factors need to go into making this decision? Well, first let's look at when you should tend to putting all your eggs in one basket. You should tend to hold a more concentrated portfolio when you are conducting in-depth stock analysis. So that is that you're looking into the details of businesses and analysing them in depth and trying to understand the markets that those companies operate in. You can be less diversified when you're investing with smaller amounts of money. The consequences of getting one of those investments wrong will be less. Similarly, if you're investing earlier in life, then you will have more time to overcome any of those initial mistakes or any times that you didn't fully understand a stock yet were concentrated in it. Likewise, when you're an experienced investor, so you're more likely to be able to spot the potential issues. You're more likely to have experience of knowing when stocks are likely to go to zero or are likely to be frauds, and are therefore able to hold a more concentrated portfolio. Especially when you can influence or exercise control over the investment outcome, is a situation where you can be more concentrated. The reasons being that with that influence, you are likely to be able to understand the outcome. So this would be owners of individual businesses or investors who are taking board positions in their investee companies. Likewise, if you have other sources of income, you're more robust. You don't have to live off the investments. So if a particular investment goes wrong, this does not seriously damage your source of income, and you can be more concentrated in that situation. In contrast, well, when should you put all your eggs into multiple baskets? Well, you should tend to hold a more diversified portfolio when you are for example, relying on simple quant methods or very simple metrics like price earnings ratios or other ratios, rather than doing in-depth analysis on the markets and the specific business that you're investing in. When you're investing with larger amounts of money, then it pays to be more diversified. If you were already independently wealthy, then being more independently wealthy does not gain you much in life. Whereas to lose that freedom and that wealth could have a significant impact on your life. Therefore, you should be more cautious and be more diversified with your investments. Also, if you're investing later in life, then you or you're reliant on your investment performance for most of your living expenses, then this means that you've got less time to overcome the volatility that being more concentrated might cause. Therefore, you should be more diversified. If you're a novice investor, it pays to be more diversified. And also, when you have little or no influence on your invested companies, if you're along for the ride, then you're probably unable to take specific action to correct the course of those companies if they go awry. And in that case, you should be more diversified. Note, however, several of these can pull in different directions. You're more likely to be experienced later in life, but you also have less time to make up for those periods of chance underperformance. And you're more likely to require your investments to fund your day-to-day spending the later you are in life. So determining the right level of diversification for you and your portfolio will require balancing these competing factors, and it may not be clear-cut how diversified you should be from simple analysis. With these factors in mind and viewed through this framework, we also see why Warren Buffett suggests that diversification was not a good thing. He was doing in-depth stock research. He was investing earlier in life, so he started investing very early in his teens, and he was very experienced. Through that investing experience, working for Benjamin Graham, doing his Columbia degree, he gained a lot of experience of investing. And he also tended to exercise a high degree of influence or control. He takes very large stakes in companies, or he takes over the whole of the company and runs the company inside his investment vehicles. That used to be the Buffett Partnership Limited and is now Berkshire Hathaway. So within these factors in mind, it makes perfect sense why he would be somebody who is willing to put all his eggs in one basket. However, even if you have these advantages in life, even if you are doing in-depth stock research, you are young and experienced and exercising a high degree of control, then there are a number of potential problems with deciding to be a highly concentrated investor. And I'm going to look at a few of these problems now. So the first problem is that we tend to be overconfident about what we know and about our abilities. So if you ask a room full of people who thinks here they are better than average driver, then at least 80% of the hands usually go up. If the room is sampled from the general population and you haven't happened to stumble upon a conference for advanced drivers, then it's highly unlikely that such a high proportion of those people are above average. But that's how we view ourselves. We view ourselves often as above average, and this is known as overconfidence. I'll leave you to decide what that says about whether you are an above average investor or not. But we'll have a look at a particular study here that was done as far back as 1965 into overconfidence. So this is done by Stuart Oskamp and was called Overconfidence in Case Study Judgments. And he was a psychologist, and he was asking other psychologists to assess the particular personality traits and neuroses of a series of patients. And he gave them case files with increasing levels of information. And he had 4 levels. So he started off by giving the psychologists the least amount of information. And you see that on this chart that with the least amount of information, they got about, sort of mid to late 20% of accuracy on these personality judgments. It's difficult to assess somebody's personality. However, when they asked the experts how confident they were in their judgments, they were above 30% confident in their judgment. And then he added more information. And in this graph, you can see that in each stage, as he added more information, it didn't really add much to the accuracy of the judgment on these patients. However, what you'll notice is the confidence that these psychologists had in their judgment absolutely soared. So they started off, slightly overconfident and slightly more uncalibrated, and they ended up with the most amount of information as very uncalibrated and very overconfident. And you can see the issue and how this applies to investing is that the most information area is where the putting your eggs in one basket and watching it like a hawk lives. The more information you do, the more you think you're overcoming ignorance. It's possible that you're also becoming more overconfident and less calibrated about what you know. Increasing information leads to greater overconfidence in many cases. So overconfidence leads us to underestimate the chance of bad things happening to us. It leads us to overestimate how much we know about our investments, the markets, or the future. And it leads us to be less diversified than we should be for our real level of knowledge and understanding. Here's an example of overconfidence or potential overconfidence. I think indeed even the brilliant Buffett may have been overconfident at times. Consider this example of Dempster Mill. Buffett held this maker of farm equipment in his original Buffett Partnership Limited back in the 1960s. So the Buffett Partnership Limited buys 70% of Dempster Mill at about $28. At some point it represents sort of over 20% of the Buffett Partnership Limited assets. However, this is a company that is struggling in some ways, hence why Buffett was attracted to it in his original partnership. But the management of the company were resistant to the changes that were needed to turn the business round. And the bank almost pulled the plug and put the company into receivership. Charlie Munger introduced Buffett to a guy called Harry Bottle, and he actually managed to turn it around. And in the end, it was sold for $80 a share. So this is a pretty successful Buffett investment. So why am I, kind of saying this is an example of overconfidence? Well, years later, Buffett had this to say about the man he hired, Harry Bottle. He says, hiring Harry may have been the most important management decision I ever made. Dempster was in big trouble under the 2 previous managers, and the banks were treating us as a potential bankrupt. If Dempster had gone down, my life and my fortunes would have been a lot different from that time forward. So I think regardless of the outcome, I don't think I would like my life and my fortunes to ever be dependent on a single hiring outcome. And I think to leave yourself exposed to that could potentially be called overconfidence. And moving on, I think there's a second problem with running very concentrated portfolios, and that is the impact of what's called unknown unknowns. and what the impact these can have on our investment outcomes. For example, who would have foreseen that a single well blowout would have caused BP to lose $62 billion in fines and compensation? Donald Rumsfeld, the I think former Secretary of State in the US, famously described this concept in these terms. He said, "Reports that say something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns, there are things that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know. And if one looks throughout history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones." And I think we can apply that to our investing as well. It's the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones for our investments. When something is so unique or rare that it's completely outside our ability to imagine it, then we lose the ability to effectively prepare for its impact. It becomes a failure, not of preparation, but of imagination. And there's a phrase that we use to describe our inability to perceive risks that are outside our current experience in investing. It's a black swan. The idea is that prior to the discovery of Australia, then every swan we would have seen would have been white. And therefore we would have happily stated that we are certain that all swans are white. Discovering a new land, however, also led to the discovery of the black swan, and was something we could not have perceived existed before. You only have to see the impact of the current coronavirus on the world economy to see the impact that previously unexpected black swans can have on our investments. Whether we prepared for pandemics or whether we even did exercise to plan for this, I don't think anybody would have foreseen the total lockdowns of Western economies and the issues that this has caused. The problem is that because these are outside our ability to perceive them, or at least perceive the impact, these don't feature in our assessment of risk at all. Watching like a hawk for these doesn't work because we're unable to see them no matter how intently we stare. As Baz Luhrmann says, the real troubles in your life are apt to be things that never crossed your worried mind, the kind that blindside you at 4 p.m. on some idle Tuesday. So now if we come back to the original quote from Warren Buffett that I started this presentation with, diversification is a protection against ignorance. It makes little sense if you know what you're doing. And consider the impact of overconfidence and black swan events. We are probably far more ignorant about the possible outcomes for our investments than we're willing to admit to ourselves. The natural conclusion from this is that we tend to be less diversified than we really should be. And we should aim to be more diversified. So the solution, well, a good start is to use the framework I've described in this talk to determine how diversified you should be. Are you doing exhaustive research? Or are you reliant on your investments for your living expenses? Are you experienced? Are you young? Do you have a lot of time to make up for future unknown unknowns? Then to help mitigate your overconfidence and the impact of unknown unknowns, you should err on the side of caution and diversify more than you think is necessary. Well, one practical way that you can keep yourself sufficiently diversified is by setting upper portfolio limits. This is where you set an upper limit to the amount you'll hold in any one stock. This may depend on your personal circumstances. If you want to be particularly diversified, this could be 3 or 5%. If you are lucky, like Warren Buffett, and you're able to be more concentrated, this may be 5 or 10, 15, 20%. But having an upper limit on one stock doesn't help if you hold all oil companies. We've seen the oil price of oil very recently drop to negative levels for some contracts, and the effect of the coronavirus has wiped out a lot of the pricing power that oil companies have. So what you're seeing is if your portfolio consisted completely of 100 oil companies, you've probably taken very significant losses in the last couple of months. So therefore, it also makes sense to have an upper limit to the amount you'll hold in any one sector or industry. You should think about the potential correlation to outcomes of your portfolio constituents, as well as just the total number that you hold. And choose this level conservatively, remembering that you're probably overconfident. So if you think you were comfortable with a 10% upper portfolio limit, you should probably be setting it somewhere in the region of half that, maybe 5%, to cover for the fact that you will be overconfident in how in the levels of losses that you will be willing to take in any one stock. I describe ways in which you can improve your portfolio using limits further in my book, so do pick up a copy if you want to look into that some more. And finally, before leaving this topic, it's worth looking into a bit of detail about one of the objections investors raise about diversification. And the idea is that people often say that the more stocks you own, the more likely you are going to end up tracking the broad stock market indexes. Now, this comes from research that was done in 1970 by Lawrence Fisher and James H. Lorry, called Some Studies of Variability of Returns on Investments in Common Stocks. When they were looking into how many stocks you need to own to remove the variability from your portfolio. At the time, investors wanted exposure to a broad stock market index, but index funds and ETFs were not widely available, and the cost of maintaining a portfolio of hundreds and hundreds of stocks was quite costly. So Fisher and Lorry found that portfolios of just 32 stocks chosen at random removed 95% of the variability in the distribution of returns. Note that the authors were looking at ways to track the market, not to avoid tracking it. And this means that having more than 32 stocks does not imply that you will simply track the stock market index. The first thing to consider is that a more recent study by Ronald J. Sertz and Michael Price, called The Truth About Diversification by Numbers, used a better measure called tracking error, and found that only 60 randomly selected stocks only removed 88% of the tracking risk. So it seems that even 32 randomly chosen stocks are not sufficient to really track the market. But more importantly, applying the principle's basic logic to these studies leads us to ask the question, are your stock picks random? If your stock picking skill is no better than throwing darts at the Financial Times, then diversification greater than 60 stocks is likely to lead to you holding an expensive market tracker. However, if you have skill and your stock picks are not essentially random, then there is no reason to think that these stocks should always track the market. Indeed, quant funds hold hundreds of stocks and aim to beat the market by gaining exposure to risk factors or market anomalies that have been historically shown to outperform versus an index. There is no reason that diversification should lead to market tracking by a skillful investor. It is possible to hold too many stocks and not have the time to follow them in enough detail and understand the investment case. But most investors are overconfident, and most investors end up a long way from this limit of not being able to sufficiently analyze and assess stocks. So this brings me to the end of this talk. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about diversification, and hopefully this gives you some ideas to apply to improving your own portfolios. If you did, and if you want to hear some more ideas for improving your portfolio, then please buy my book, which is full of similar insight into some of the biggest questions in investing. If you've bought it already, thank you very much. Please do leave me a review on Amazon. I'd love to hear what other investors think about it. Please also subscribe to my channel to watch my other videos. And if you have any questions or want any other book recommendations, please check out my website, email me, or follow me on Twitter. Thanks for joining, and good investing.